"Ranger's cold, we're done for the day." That's what the range officer said at 4:17 in the afternoon, after 63 shooters had spent 8 hours trying to hit a 600-yard steel plate, and every single one of them had missed. Then a 78-year-old man with a hickory cane and a voice like gravel asked for one more round. Just one. The range officer almost said no. He should have said no. The event was over, the line was cold, the volunteers were packing up. But something about the way the old man asked made him pause. 60 seconds later, that man loaded a single cartridge into a borrowed rifle, pressed the trigger once, and the electronic target camera 600 yards downrange confirmed what no one on that line had managed all day. Dead center. If you believe that one round is all it takes when the right man sends it, type bullseye in the comments and stay for this story. Thomas Earl Dancy had not been called by his real name in so long that he sometimes forgot it belonged to him. In the army, he had been Dancy. In Special Forces, he had been Ghost. A call sign earned during a training exercise at Camp McCall in 1971 when he disappeared from an evasion lane for so long that the tracking team filed a lost person report with the base operations center, only to discover him sitting on the hood of their own vehicle in the parking lot, eating an apple when they returned from the search. After the army, he had been Tom to the people in town, Mr. Dancy to the kids at the elementary school where he'd worked as a janitor for 18 years, and Pop to his granddaughter, Elise, who was the only person on earth whose phone calls he answered on the first ring. He was 78 years old. He stood 5 feet 10 and weighed 161 pounds, which was 4 pounds lighter than he'd been at his fighting weight in 1972, and which his doctor said was too thin but which Thomas considered exactly right. His body was an inventory of damage. Left knee, rebuilt, the ligaments replaced with cadaver tissue in 2007. Right shoulder, torn rotator cuff, never repaired, because the VA had waitlisted him for surgery in 2011, and by the time they called, he'd taught himself to compensate and no longer wanted anyone cutting into him. Lower back, 3 herniated discs, the result of 30 years of carrying rucksacks that weighed between 60 and 110 pounds over terrain that God had designed specifically to break human spines. And his hands. The hands were the thing that mattered most, and the thing that had deteriorated least. His hands were steady, not perfectly steady. There was a fine tremor in the left that appeared after his 3rd cup of coffee and disappeared when he stopped drinking it. But the right hand, the trigger hand, was as quiet as it had been in 1973 when he'd shot a perfect score on the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg, and the range instructor had written in his evaluation, "This soldier does not appear to have a pulse when firing." Thomas had kept the evaluation. It was in a shoebox in his closet alongside 2 bronze stars, a silver star, 3 purple hearts, a combat infantryman badge, a Special Forces tab, and a senior parachutist badge with a bronze star denoting combat jumps. He did not display these items, he did not mention them. The shoebox sat in the closet behind a pair of winter boots, and the only person who knew it was there was Elise, who had found it when she was 11, and had asked him what the medals were for, and Thomas had said, "They're for being in the wrong place at the right time," and she had accepted this explanation with the uncritical trust of a child and had never asked again. He lived in a cabin, not a log cabin, but a proper timber frame structure he'd built in 1994 on 12 acres of mountain land outside Dahlonega, Georgia. Dahlonega was not a random choice. It was the home of the 5th Ranger Training Battalion and the Mountain Ranger Camp, and Thomas had spent formative months of his military career in those mountains, learning to move through terrain that would kill the unprepared and to shoot in conditions that would humble the overconfident. The land was familiar to him in the way that a language is familiar, not just understood but felt, the grammar of its ridges and hollows and creek beds written into his nervous system by years of navigation under stress. His wife, Catherine, had loved the property. She'd planted a garden along the south-facing slope, tomatoes, peppers, squash, herbs, and she'd tended it for 22 years until the cancer took her ability to kneel, and then her ability to stand, and then her ability to stay. She died in 2019, in the bedroom of the cabin, in the bed they'd shared for 31 years, with Thomas holding her hand and the garden going to seed outside the window, because he'd stopped tending it when the hospice nurse arrived and hadn't started again since. The garden was still there. The beds were overgrown now, the fence posts leaning, the soil reverting to the clay and rock that had been there before Catherine coaxed it into producing life. Thomas walked past it every morning on his way to the workshop where he kept his tools and his lathe, and the reloading bench where he'd once spent weekends producing ammunition, with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between a hit and a miss could be measured in grains of powder and thousandths of an inch. He hadn't reloaded in over a year. He hadn't fired a weapon in longer than that. The desire hadn't left. The desire never left. Not for a man whose primary skill set was the application of precise violence at distance. But the infrastructure had eroded. The drive to the range was 40 minutes. The walk from the parking lot to the firing line was 150 yards. The act of getting down into a prone position and getting back up again was a negotiation with his body that took longer each time and yielded worse terms. So the rifle stayed in the safe and the reloading bench gathered dust, and Thomas Dancy lived his days in the quiet, deliberate rhythm of a man who was conserving what remained. But the skill was still there. The skill was always there. 26 years in Army Special Forces, a career that had taken him to Vietnam, Laos, El Salvador, Panama, Colombia, and places that did not appear on any itinerary he'd ever been shown, had built something in Thomas Dancy's nervous system that time and age and deterioration could not reach. The ability to read wind, judge distance, control breathing, manage a trigger, and send a bullet to a precise point in space was not stored in his muscles, or his joints, or his eyes. It was stored deeper than that, in the architecture of his attention, in the relationship between his mind and his hands, in the place where consciousness meets the physical world and makes it obey. That place was intact. That place was untouched. And on a Saturday in October, it would remind 63 people that the most dangerous thing on any range is not the rifle, it's the man behind it. The event was called the North Georgia Veterans Benefit Shoot, and it was organised annually by the Lumpkin County Veterans Council to raise money for local veterans services, transportation to VA appointments, emergency housing assistance, and a fund that helped cover funeral expenses for veterans whose families couldn't afford them. The event was held at the Wolf Creek Shooting Complex, a private range built into the side of a mountain north of Dahlonega, with covered firing positions and steel targets set at distances from 100 to 1,000 yards. The format was informal, not a scored competition but a charity shoot, where participants paid $50 for a half day of firing at various distances, with prizes awarded for notable performances. There was a barbecue. There was a raffle. There were tables selling ammunition and accessories and T-shirts with unit insignias. The atmosphere was festive in the particular way that gatherings of veterans are festive. Loud, profane, full of stories that would horrify civilians and delight anyone who'd been there, and underscored by the unspoken understanding that every person present had signed a contract that included the possibility of dying, and that this shared willingness created a bond that transcended age, branch, rank, and era. 63 shooters had registered. They came from across North Georgia and the surrounding states. Retired infantry, artillery, armour, aviation, and support personnel. Active duty soldiers from Fort Moore. A handful of Marines. One retired Navy SEAL who had driven from Savannah specifically for the barbecue, and a scattering of law enforcement veterans who had served in the military before going into policing. The equipment on the line ranged from bone stock hunting rifles to heavily modified precision platforms, and the skill levels ranged from Sunday plinkers to former military marksmen who still shot competitively. The range officer was a retired command sergeant major named Earl Hobbs, 61 years old, built like a fire hydrant, voiced like a foghorn, who ran the line with the efficiency and volume of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that soldiers didn't kill each other on training ranges. Hobbs knew every shooter on the line by name, or if not by name, then by branch and era, and he managed the relays with a combination of iron discipline and genuine warmth that kept the event running smoothly despite the inherent chaos of 63 armed veterans on a single range. Thomas arrived at 10:30, which was late. The event had started at 8. He'd intended to arrive on time, but his knee had been bad that morning, the kind of bad that makes you stand at the edge of the bed for 5 minutes before deciding whether today is a day you can walk. And by the time he'd worked through the stiffness and driven down the mountain, the first 3 relays had already been fired. Elise had wanted to come with him, but she had a shift at the hospital in Gainesville. She was a respiratory therapist, 26 years old, and Thomas was prouder of her than he was of anything he'd ever done in uniform, though he'd never said so in those words. And Thomas had told her he was fine going alone. He was fine going alone. He was fine doing most things alone. Solitude was not a hardship for Thomas Dancy. It was a habitat. He parked his truck, a 2004 Toyota Tacoma with a camper shell and 212,000 miles, and walked to the registration table. The walk took longer than it should have. The parking area was gravel, and gravel was difficult with the cane, and he had to concentrate on each step in a way that made him feel old in a manner that the mirror didn't. His face looked fine, weathered, tanned, lean. The face of a man who'd spent decades outdoors and hadn't softened in retirement. But his walk betrayed him. The walk said 78 louder than anything else. The woman at the registration table was named Brenda Yancey, and she was the wife of one of the council members and had been running the sign-in for 7 years. She smiled at Thomas and handed him a lanyard with a participant number. "Welcome, sir. Are you shooting today or spectating?" "Shooting," Thomas said. "Wonderful. Do you have your own rifle?" "No, ma'am. I was hoping to borrow one." Brenda's smile didn't waver, but her eyes made a quick assessment. The cane, the age, the empty hands, and arrived at a conclusion that most people in her position would have reached. This was a nice old man who wanted to participate and would need some gentle handling. "We have a few loaners available," she said. "Let me get one of the range volunteers to set you up." She called over a young man named Kyle Beckett, 24, a recently separated Army specialist who was volunteering at the event and who approached Thomas with the careful, slightly overloud courtesy that young people often deploy when addressing the elderly, as if volume and enunciation were acts of respect rather than assumptions of frailty. "Sir, let me get you a rifle and find you a spot on the line. Have you done much shooting before?" Thomas looked at Kyle for a moment. The question was innocent. The young man didn't know. "Some," Thomas said. Kyle led him to the equipment table, where 3 loaner rifles were laid out. 2 Remington 700s and a Savage 110, all in .308 Winchester, all functional but unremarkable. Thomas picked up the first Remington, cycled the bolt, dry-fired it once, set it down. Picked up the second, did the same. Picked up the Savage, cycled the bolt, pressed the trigger, and held the rifle for an extra second, feeling the break, feeling the reset, feeling the relationship between the trigger mechanism and his finger. "This one," he said. Kyle looked surprised. "You sure? That one's got a heavier trigger than the Remingtons." "I know. I like a heavier trigger." This was true, and it was true for a reason that Kyle would not have understood and that Thomas did not explain. In Special Forces, Thomas had been trained on weapons with heavier trigger pulls than civilian competition rifles used. Not because heavy triggers are inherently better, but because in combat conditions, with adrenaline flooding the system and fine motor control degrading, a heavier trigger provides a margin of safety against unintended discharge. Thomas had fired tens of thousands of rounds through triggers set between 3 and 5 pounds. His muscle memory was calibrated to that weight. A lighter trigger would have felt wrong, like reaching for a door handle and finding it an inch lower than expected. The body knows what it knows, and what Thomas's body knew was a 3.5 pound break with minimal overtravel, which is exactly what the Savage's AccuTrigger provided. Kyle directed him to a firing position on the left side of the line near the end, where the crowd was thinner and the bench had a clear view of the target array. Thomas settled into the bench and spent 10 minutes doing something that Kyle interpreted as an old man getting comfortable. But that was actually a systematic environmental assessment, conducted with the same methodology Thomas had used on every range, rooftop, hilltop, and concealed position he'd occupied in 26 years of Special Forces operations. He read the wind flags, 3 of them, set at 100-yard intervals. He read the mirage, the heat shimmer rising from the ground, which told him what the wind was doing between the flags. He looked at the vegetation on the hillside beyond the targets, the way the grass moved, the way the trees at the ridgeline bent, the pattern of motion that indicated prevailing wind direction and speed. He looked at the sky, cloud cover, sun angle, the direction of the shadows, all of which affected thermal conditions on the range. And then he looked at the targets. There were 6 steel plates set at various distances, 100 yards, 200, 300, 400, 500, and 600. The plates at 100 through 400 were large, 18 to 24 inches in diameter, and had been ringing consistently all day as shooters of various skill levels connected with them. The 500-yard plate was smaller, 12 inches, and had been hit sporadically, maybe once every 3 or 4 relays. And then there was the 600-yard plate. The 600-yard plate was the challenge target. It was 10 inches in diameter, roughly the size of a dinner plate, set on a post at the far end of the range corridor, 600 yards from the firing line, against a dirt berm that had been pockmarked all day by rounds that had missed. It was equipped with an electronic target camera, a system that used a video feed to record impacts on or near the target and display them in real time on a monitor at the scoring table. The camera had been running all day. The monitor had shown impact after impact on the berm behind and beside the plate. Not one of them had been on the plate. 63 shooters, hundreds of rounds, 8 hours. Not a single confirmed hit on the 600-yard plate. 0. The plate had become the day's running joke. A dare, a dragon, the thing that everyone tried and no one conquered. Shooters would fire their strings at the closer targets, build up their confidence, then send a few rounds at the 600-yard plate with the hopeful recklessness of a man throwing a quarter into a wishing well. Some came close. The camera showed impacts within inches, but close doesn't ring steel, and the plate had been silent all day. The sound it would make if struck, a deep, resonant clang that carries across a mountain valley like a bell, had not been heard once. By mid-afternoon, a handwritten note had been taped to the scoring monitor. 600-yard plate, 0 confirmed hits. If you ring it, your name goes on the wall. The wall in question was a plywood board inside the range office, where notable achievements were recorded in permanent marker. Longest confirmed hit, tightest group, most consecutive bulls at 100 yards. A 600-yard cold-bore hit on a 10-inch plate with a loaner rifle would be the kind of thing that got talked about for years. Thomas observed all of this. He didn't participate in the early relays. He sat at his bench and watched other shooters fire, studying the way their rounds behaved at distance, where they impacted relative to the targets, how the wind moved them, what the mirage was telling him about conditions between the line and the 600-yard berm. He was doing math, not with a calculator or a ballistic app. Thomas didn't own a smartphone and had no interest in acquiring one, but in his head, using the estimation methods he'd been taught at the Special Forces sniper course in 1974 and had refined over 26 years of operational shooting. He was calculating bullet drop at 600 yards for a .308 Winchester, firing 168 grain match ammunition, which he'd confirmed was the load being used in the loaners by reading the box at the ammunition table. He was calculating wind deflection based on what the mirage and flags told him, a variable crosswind from the right, averaging 6 to 8 miles per hour with gust 12, inconsistent because the mountain terrain created eddies and reversals that changed every few minutes. He was calculating the hold correction required to put a bullet on a 10-inch plate at 600 yards with a scope he'd never used before, a rifle he'd never fired, and a single cartridge. Because Thomas had already decided that he would fire one round, not a group, not a string, one round. That was how he'd been trained. In the teams, ammunition was weight, and weight was energy, and energy was finite. You carried what you needed and you didn't waste it. One round, one target, one result. The discipline of the single shot was the foundation of Special Forces marksmanship, and it was the discipline that Thomas had carried with him long after the operational reasons for it had ceased to apply. One round was enough if the round was placed correctly. And Thomas Dancy had spent 26 years learning how to place a round correctly under conditions far more challenging than a bench-rested charity shoot on a Saturday afternoon. The afternoon wore on. The crowd thinned. By 3:30, many of the shooters had packed up and moved to the barbecue area, where the smell of pulled pork and charcoal had been competing with the smell of gunpowder since noon. The relays became less frequent, the firing line less populated. Thomas remained at his bench. He hadn't fired a single round. Kyle Beckett had checked on him twice, once to ask if he needed anything, and once to remind him that the line would go cold at 4 o'clock for the day's final ceasefire. Thomas had thanked him both times and remained where he was. He was waiting. Not for anything specific, not for the perfect wind condition or the optimal moment, because those things don't exist at 600 yards in mountain terrain. He was waiting because the waiting was part of the process. The stillness that preceded a shot was not empty time. It was active time, time during which the body settled, the breathing deepened, the heart rate lowered, and the mind moved from the general to the specific. From the broad awareness of the environment to the singular focus on a point in space, 10 inches in diameter, 600 yards away, barely visible to the naked eye. Thomas was entering a state that he had entered hundreds of times before, the state that Special Forces snipers call the bubble, where the world outside the scope ceases to exist, and the only reality is the target, the crosshair, and the space between them. Getting there took time, more time now than it used to. The body was slower, the mind took longer to quiet, the distractions of age, the ache in the knee, the stiffness in the shoulder, the awareness of his own mortality that lived in the background of every thought, were harder to set aside. But the bubble was still accessible, the door was still there, and when Thomas found it, when the world narrowed and the noise fell away, and the only thing left was the plate and the crosshair and the wind, he would know, and then he would fire. At 4:02, Earl Hobbs picked up the megaphone and announced the final ceasefire. "All shooters, the line is going cold. Clear your weapons and step back. Rangers closing in 15 minutes. The remaining shooters on the line, 8 of them, down from the day's peak of 40, cleared their rifles, made them safe, and stepped back from the benches. Thomas did not move. He was still seated at his bench, the savage rifle in front of him, unfired, the bolt open, the chamber empty. Hobbs walked the line, checking each position, and reached Thomas last. "Sir, we're shutting down. Need you to clear your weapon and step back." "I haven't fired it yet," Thomas said. Hobbs looked at the rifle. Open bolt. No brass on the bench, no holes in any target. "You've been out here for 5 hours and you haven't fired a round?" "No. Why not?" Thomas looked at the 600-yard plate. It was a dark circle against the tan dirt of the berm, small enough at that distance to be covered by a thumbnail held at arm's length. "I was waiting for the 600. Hobbs followed his gaze. He looked at the plate. He looked at the scoring monitor, which still read 0 confirmed hits. He looked at Thomas, the cane leaning against the bench, the weathered hands, the eyes that were not old, not even close to old, despite the face they were set in. Hobbs had been running ranges for 30 years. He had seen thousands of shooters, and he had developed, over those 30 years, an instinct for the ones who were different, the ones who didn't talk about what they could do but simply did it, the ones who moved with a particular economy, who handled weapons with a particular familiarity, who looked at targets with a particular quality of attention. He was seeing that quality now. "1 round?" Hobbs asked. "1 round." Hobbs looked at the line. The other shooters had stepped back. The range was functionally cold. Opening it for a single round from a single shooter would require recalling the line hot, which was a procedural irritation but not a safety issue. The volunteers packing up the equipment would have to pause. The scoring crew would have to remain at the monitor. It was an imposition. "Range is closed, sir. I'm sorry." Thomas nodded. He accepted the decision without argument, the way a man who has spent a career operating under rules accepts rules, even when he disagrees with them. He began to stand slowly, using the cane to lever himself up from the bench, the process visible and effortful in the way that old bodies make effort visible, whether their owners want them to or not. And that was when a voice from behind them said, "Let him shoot." Hobbs turned. The voice belonged to a man who had been standing 10 feet away watching the exchange. He was in his late 50s, tall, with close-cropped grey hair, and the bearing of someone who had spent significant time in uniform. His name was Colonel Frank Metcalf, U.S. Army, retired, and he was the president of the Lumpkin County Veterans Council, the organization that ran the benefit shoot. Metcalf had been on the range all day, greeting participants, managing logistics, and making sure the event ran smoothly. He had noticed Thomas earlier, not because of anything Thomas had done, but because of what he hadn't done. A man who sits at a firing bench for 5 hours without shooting is either confused or patient, and Metcalf could tell the difference. "Let him take his shot, Earl," Metcalf said. "We're not in a hurry." Hobbs looked at Metcalf, then at Thomas, then at the 600-yard plate. "1 round," Hobbs said. "I'm recalling the line hot for 1 round, then we're done." He raised the megaphone. "All personnel, the line is going hot for 1 final round. 1 shooter, 1 round. Stand clear of the firing line." The announcement drew attention. The 8 shooters who had stepped back from the line turned to watch. A few people from the barbecue area drifted toward the firing line, pulled by the announcement and the curiosity that follows any break in routine. The scoring crew who had been covering the monitor uncovered it. By the time Thomas settled back into his bench, approximately 20 people were watching. They didn't know what they were watching. They saw an old man with a cane, a loaner rifle, and a single cartridge. They saw the 600-yard plate, the plate that had defeated every shooter all day, and most of them assumed they were about to watch a miss, because that's what 600 yards of mountain air does to a 10-inch target when 63 trained shooters have already tried and failed. Thomas didn't notice the audience. He was in the bubble. He loaded one round, a single Federal Gold Medal match cartridge, 168 grain Sierra Match King, the same ammunition that had been available all day to every shooter on the line. He closed the bolt with a smooth, deliberate motion, seating the round into the chamber. He settled the stock into his shoulder. The cheek weld was wrong. The comb was too low for the scope height, a problem he'd identified 5 hours ago, so he shifted his head slightly forward, finding the sweet spot where his eye aligned with the scope's exit pupil. The image cleared. The crosshair appeared. And 600 yards away, the steel plate resolved from a dark smudge into a defined circle with edges and a centre. The wind was blowing. He could feel it on his right cheek, a crosswind from the right. The same prevailing pattern that had been running all day, but lighter now in the late afternoon as the thermals diminished with the declining sun. He estimated 6 miles per hour. At 600 yards, with a .308 Winchester, a 6 mile per hour full-value crosswind would push the bullet approximately 14 inches to the left. On a 10-inch plate, 14 inches of uncorrected wind would be a clean miss. He held right. Not with the scope. He didn't adjust the turrets because he'd never fired this scope and didn't trust its tracking. But with the reticle, placing the crosshair 14 inches to the right of the plate's centre, which at 600 yards translated to approximately 2 1/3 minutes of angle. He held for drop. The point, .308 Winchester firing a 168 grain bullet at the muzzle velocity printed on the ammunition box would drop approximately 106 inches at 600 yards, nearly 9 feet. He dialed the scope's elevation turret, counting the clicks, estimating the adjustment based on the assumption that the scope tracked at a 1/4 minute per click. He didn't know if that assumption was correct. He was trusting the equipment because he had no choice, and he was compensating for the uncertainty by being precise about everything he could control. His breathing slowed. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. The crosshair settled. It was not still. Nothing is still at 600 yards through a scope. Not the crosshair, not the target, not the air between them. But it was as still as Thomas's body could make it, which was stiller than most shooters could achieve on their best day in their prime with their own equipment on a perfect range. The trigger was under his finger. He'd taken up the slack. The breakpoint was close. He could feel the sear engagement, the resistance that preceded release. There was a moment, a fraction of a second, a pause between heartbeats, when everything aligned. The crosshair was where it needed to be. The wind was where he'd read it. His body was still. His mind was clear. And in that fraction of a second, Thomas Dancy pressed the trigger. The rifle fired. The recoil was moderate. The Savage's synthetic stock absorbed some of it, and Thomas's shoulder absorbed the rest, rolling with the impulse rather than fighting it, the way a boxer rolls with a punch. The sound was sharp and flat, the crack of a supersonic bullet leaving a 22-inch barrel, and it echoed off the mountain behind the range in a rolling report that took 2 seconds to return. Thomas didn't move after the shot. He stayed on the scope, watching. At 600 yards, the bullet would take approximately 3/4 of a second to reach the target. 3/4 of a second is a very long time when you've just sent a single round at a 10-inch plate that 63 people have missed all day. It is long enough to doubt. Long enough to replay the trigger press and wonder if you pulled instead of pressed. Long enough to feel the wind on your face and wonder if it shifted in the instant between your decision and the bullet's departure. Long enough to feel the weight of every variable you couldn't control, the ammunition you didn't load, the rifle you didn't zero, the scope you've never trusted, and wonder if any of them conspired against you. Thomas felt none of this. He had pressed the trigger correctly. He knew this because he knew what a correct trigger press felt like, the way a pianist knows what a correct key strike feels like. Not through analysis, but through the immediate, undeniable feedback of a motion performed correctly 10,000 times. The trigger broke, the shot left, and 3/4 of a second later the 600-yard steel plate rang. The sound was unmistakable. A deep, resonant clang that rolled across the valley like a struck bell, a sound that was different from every other sound on a rifle range. Different from the crack of the rifle, different from the thump of a bullet hitting dirt, different from the ping of a ricochet off rock. It was the sound of steel being struck by a bullet travelling at approximately 1,800 feet per second, and it was a sound that had not been heard once in 8 hours of continuous shooting. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. The sound travelled across the range, reflected off the mountain, and returned as a fading echo. The 20 people watching stood in the particular stillness of humans who have just witnessed something their brains need a moment to process. Then Earl Hobbs, who was standing behind Thomas with his megaphone in one hand, turned to the scoring monitor. The electronic target camera had captured the impact. The image was clear, a frozen frame showing the steel plate with a fresh mark dead center, the splash of copper jacket and lead core visible as a bright smear against the dark steel. Dead center, not an inch high, not 2 inches right. Dead center. The plate's center was marked with a small orange dot that the range crew had painted for reference, and the impact was touching that dot. At 600 yards, with a loaner rifle, with factory ammunition, with 1 round, a 78-year-old man had just put a bullet exactly where he intended it to go. Hobbs stared at the monitor. Then he looked at Thomas, who was still behind the rifle, still on the scope, still in the bubble. Thomas pulled his eye from the scope. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent case, which he caught in his right hand out of habit. You don't leave your brass, not ever, not even at a charity shoot, and set the rifle down on the bench. Then he looked at Hobbs. Confirmed? He asked. Hobbs looked at the monitor again, then back at Thomas. Confirmed, he said. Dead center. Only hit of the day. The silence broke. Someone behind the line started clapping. A single person, then 2, then the full group. 20 people applauding a single shot that most of them hadn't believed was possible. Thomas didn't acknowledge the applause. He was reaching for his cane, levering himself up from the bench, and the effort of standing was visible and unglamorous, and completely at odds with what he'd just done from a seated position. The contrast was the thing. The man who couldn't stand up without a cane had just made the shot of the day from 600 yards. The body was failing, the skill was not, and the gap between those two realities was the space in which Thomas Dancy's entire story lived. Metcalf reached him first. The colonel had been standing behind the line when the plate rang, and the sound had done something to him. Not shock exactly, but the particular jolt of recognition that comes when you witness a level of competence that you've only encountered in specific professional contexts. Metcalf had spent 27 years in the army. He had commanded rifle companies and battalions. He knew what good shooting looked like. And what he'd just seen was not good shooting. It was something beyond good, something that lived in the territory between excellence and art, where the technical and the intuitive merged into a single seamless act. That was one hell of a shot, Metcalf said. Thomas shrugged. The wind cooperated. The wind didn't have anything to do with it. You held for the wind. I watched you. Thomas looked at him. The assessment was correct, and Thomas appreciated that Metcalf had seen it. The hold, the deliberate placement of the crosshair to the right of centre, the compensation for a crosswind that the shooter controlled rather than surrendered to. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Metcalf asked. And here was the moment, the pivot point that existed in every interaction Thomas had with someone who witnessed what he could do. The moment where the question was asked, and Thomas had to decide how much to answer. He could say, the army, and leave it there. He could say special forces and let them fill in whatever assumptions they carried about what that meant. Or he could say nothing, which was his preference, and let the shot speak for itself. I was in the army, Thomas said, a long time ago. What unit? Thomas paused. He looked at Metcalf. The bearing, the rank signifiers in his posture, even in civilian clothes. The way he asked the question with the directness of an officer who expected a straight answer. 5th Special Forces Group, Thomas said. Metcalf's expression changed. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for that. But the recalibration was visible. 5th Group, Vietnam. The men who operated in small teams in the most dangerous terrain on Earth, who trained indigenous forces, conducted direct action operations, and performed long-range reconnaissance missions that required marksmanship skills several orders of magnitude beyond what conventional soldiers were trained to do. How long? 26 years, 68 to 94. Sniper qualified? Among other things, Metcalf nodded slowly. He understood now. The 5 hours of sitting, the single round, the patience, the reading, the hold. It was all doctrine, special forces doctrine, refined through thousands of hours of training and thousands more of operational application. What Thomas had done at the 600-yard plate was not a trick shot. It was a professional act performed by a man who had spent more than 2 decades perfecting it. in conditions that made this range look like a backyard. The story spread the way stories spread at events populated by veterans, quickly, with increasing specificity, and with the particular reverence that military people reserve for demonstrations of uncommon skill. Within 30 minutes, every person still at the Wolf Creek Range knew that the old man with the cane had hit the 600 plate with one round from a loner rifle. Within an hour, the details had been embellished slightly, not in the direction of exaggeration, but in the direction of completeness, as people who had been watching added their own observations. Kyle Beckett, the young volunteer who had set Thomas up with the rifle, told anyone who would listen that the old man had picked the Savage specifically because of the trigger weight, and had spent 5 hours reading the wind without firing a single round. Earl Hobbs confirmed the electronic camera footage, and noted that the impact was centered to within approximately half an inch of the plate's exact geometric center, which at 600 yards represented a degree of precision that he'd seen from purpose-built competition rifles, but never from a loner Savage with a factory scope. And Metcalf, who had learned the relevant details from Thomas in a brief and characteristically understated conversation, added the context that transformed the story from a remarkable shot into something larger. The shooter was a retired Green Beret with 26 years in Special Forces. He hadn't fired a weapon in over a year. He'd come to the event alone, and he'd asked for one round because one round was how he'd been trained. One round, one target, one result, and nothing wasted. But the person who understood the story most completely was the one who wasn't there. Elise Dancy got a phone call from her grandfather at 5:30 that evening, which was unusual because Thomas almost never called. He answered her calls, but he rarely initiated them. When she picked up, he said 4 words. "I shot today, Ellie." She could hear something in his voice that she hadn't heard in a long time. Not excitement. Thomas didn't do excitement. Something quieter. Something closer to relief. The relief of a man who had feared that the most essential part of himself had been lost to time and discovered in a single trigger press that it was still there. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Real good." She didn't push for details. She'd learned from years of loving Thomas Dancy that details came later, or not at all, and that the offering itself, the phone call, the 4 words, the willingness to share even that much, was the gift. She told him she was proud of him. He said he knew. And then he hung up because Thomas Dancy had never been good on the phone and wasn't about to start now. The electronic target camera footage was saved. Earl Hobbs downloaded it onto a USB drive and gave it to Metcalf, who posted a still image on the Veterans Council's Facebook page that evening, with a caption that read, 600 yards, 1 round, dead center. Retired Green Beret, 78 years old, loner rifle. This is what 26 years of Special Forces marksmanship training looks like. Not one wasted round. The post received 1,200 shares in the first week. Derek, his body hurt. The knee, the shoulder, the back. But the hurt was manageable, and the act of shooting was something that no amount of physical deterioration could take from him. He started going every Saturday. Not to compete, not to perform, just to practice the way he'd always practiced. Alone, focused, precise. He went because the rifle in his hands connected him to something that the rest of his life had slowly disconnected from. The version of himself that was not old, not diminished, not defined by what he'd lost. The version that was still capable of sending a single round 600 yards through mountain air and putting it exactly where it needed to go. That version was still alive. The bubble was still there, and every Saturday for 1 quiet hour on a mountain range in North Georgia, Thomas Earl Dancy stepped inside it and was whole. 3 months after the benefit shoot, Metcalf invited Thomas to serve as a marksmanship mentor for the Veterans Council's new shooting program, an initiative designed to introduce recently separated veterans to competitive and recreational shooting as a form of therapeutic recreation. Thomas agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that he wouldn't have to speak in front of groups, and that his role would be limited to sitting beside individual shooters and helping them with their technique. Metcalf accepted the conditions. Thomas began showing up on Wednesday afternoons, sitting at a bench with 1 or 2 shooters at a time, watching them fire, and offering corrections in a voice so quiet that the people on adjacent benches couldn't hear him. He didn't teach the way instructors teach, with curricular and progression plans and performance metrics. He taught the way craftsmen teach, by watching, by adjusting, by placing his hand on a shooter's shoulder and saying slower, or wait, or now. He taught trigger control by holding a pencil across the back of a shooter's hand and telling them to press the trigger without making the pencil roll. He taught wind reading by having them watch mirage for 10 minutes before firing a single round. He taught patience by sitting with them in silence until they stopped fidgeting and started seeing. The shooters who worked with Thomas improved. Not all of them. Some didn't have the temperament for the discipline Thomas demanded, but the ones who did improved in ways that surprised them, and didn't surprise Thomas at all. Because the skill was transferable, the patience was transferable, the attention was transferable. What Thomas Dancy had learned in 26 years of Special Forces marksmanship was not a secret. It was a practice, and like all practices, it could be taught to anyone willing to do the work. "You don't aim the rifle," he told a 29-year-old combat veteran who was struggling with a flinch at 300 yards. "You don't point it. You don't will the bullet to the target. You let the rifle tell you when it's ready, and then you let the trigger go. The rifle knows where it wants to shoot. Your job is to stop getting in the way." The veteran looked at him. "How do I do that?" "You get quiet," Thomas said. "Inside. You get quiet enough to hear what the rifle's telling you, and then you trust it." The veteran tried. He fired a round. It hit 3 inches from center at 300 yards. The best shot he'd produced all day. He looked at Thomas. "Like that?" "Exactly like that. Now do it again, and again, and again, until it's not something you do. It's something you are." The veteran did it again, and Thomas sat beside him, watching, his cane across his knees, his eyes on the mirage, doing in his 78th year exactly what he'd been doing since his 22nd. Watching the air, reading the conditions, and helping someone send a bullet to the place where it was supposed to go. At the following year's benefit shoot, the 600-yard plate was hit 4 times. 3 of the shooters who hit it had trained with Thomas. The 4th was Thomas himself, who fired 1 round, at 4:16 in the afternoon, and rang the plate dead center for the 2nd consecutive year. Earl Hobbs had stopped asking if he wanted more than 1 round. He knew the answer. The electronic target camera captured the impact, and the image was posted on the range office wall beside the previous year's image. 2 photographs, 2 years, 2 shots, 2 dead center impacts. And in both photographs, the same bright smear of copper and lead on the same dark steel plate, in the same precise location, as if the first bullet had left a mark and the second had come to visit it. Thomas's name was written beneath both images in Earl Hobbs's careful block lettering: Thomas E. Dancy, SFC, Ret, 5th Special Forces Group, 1 round, 1 hit. It was, Hobbs said later, the most honest marksmanship record he'd ever posted. No qualifications, no asterisks, no explanations needed, 1 round, 1 hit. That was the whole story. That was always the whole story. If this story reminded you that some skills run deeper than age can reach, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of veterans who never stopped being what the military made them. Not because they chose to, but because mastery doesn't retire. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And the next time you see an old man at a range sitting quiet, watching the wind, don't assume he's waiting for help. He might be waiting for his moment, and when it comes, 1 round will be enough.